Is your mic on? Well, we got nobody here. Have they closed the floor? They have, haven't they? You closed that last vote. Yeah. Thank you. Well, we're already almost 3 minutes late. Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, International Financial Institutions will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Potential Consequences of FinCEN's Beneficial Ownership Rulemaking. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Today's hearing focuses on beneficial ownership and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, otherwise known as FinCEN's rulemaking required by the Corporate Transparency Act, or CTA. Beneficial ownership information reporting has been touted as one of the most important national security tools, yet no one knows anything about it. It is my hope that today's hearing will not only inform our constituents of this forthcoming rule, but will shine light on the ways the Treasury Department and FinCEN have distorted the purpose of this rulemaking. Before we dive into the weeds, however, it is important to set the stage. Some of my colleagues across the aisle today may insinuate that committee Republicans never supported beneficial ownership, and our actions since the passage of the CTA were carried out to undermine legitimacy of the final rule. Nothing could be further from the truth. I personally worked with former Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney on an earlier iteration of the CTA. This bill, while not identical to the final CTA, was founded on the same principles. On one hand, federal law enforcement and our local sheriffs were banging down our doors, warning about the ways in which bad actors were hiding illicit profits in shell companies. On the other, small, medium, and large banks alike were frustrated with the burdensome regulation without any feedback from the government. To fix this problem, Chair Maloney and I decided to shift the burden from the banks and place it on the federal government. If law enforcement and FinCEN wanted the information seamlessly, they would need to be responsible for its collection. Since that initial bipartisan attempt, the CTA changed slightly but never lost its foundational principle. If the U.S. government wants the information, the U.S. government should be responsible for it. Now we find ourselves in a precarious situation. We are less than 6 months away from the CTA's effective date of January 1, 2024, and we will be left with more questions than answers. In an effort to prepare for today's hearing, I joined a letter in June with Chair McHenry, Chair Williams, and Chair Womack expressing our concerns with FinCEN's rollout of the beneficial ownership plan. This letter asks some important questions about how FinCEN plans to educate 32.6 million small businesses about their new obligations. This should not have been a difficult letter to respond to. With less than 6 months to go, the education plans should be completed and ready to roll out well before the system goes live in January. Disturbingly, despite the committee's request for information on the education and rollout strategy, there has been no response. The education issue, while it may seem trivial to those not paying attention, is indicative of the larger issues with the BOI rulemaking process. FinCEN and Treasury have transformed a simple-to-follow filing system into a complex maze, leaving many scratching their heads. As I'm sure we'll hear from our witnesses, FinCEN is asking for more money and more resources, but time and time again, they favor complexity over straightforwardness. Complexity that will result in small business owners needing to hire lawyers to figure out simple things like if they need to file. This rulemaking process must be corrected. Our constituents deserve better than what FinCEN has put forward thus far. I do not see how FinCEN can move forward with a January 1 effective date without having a plan. I ask all my colleagues to remember that if this filing system was not seamless, it is our small businesses picking up the pieces from COVID that will suffer. We need FinCEN to do better, and today's hearing shall be a start in outlining what that could look like. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, International Institutions, the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. And thank you to our witnesses for appearing today to discuss FinCEN's beneficial ownership rulemaking. As we speak, oligarchs and kleptocrats and other criminals are using anonymous shell companies to engage in money laundering, terrorist financing, tax fraud, corruption, bribery, and the list goes on with other illicit activity. That is why, under Democrat leadership, this committee passed landmark legislation to protect our national security and to prevent the abuse of our financial system by bad actors, both foreign and domestic. That was all led by then-Chair Maxine Waters. Committee Democrats achieved the most sweeping anti-money laundering reforms in decades with Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020. This major update to the Bank Secrecy Act contained the historic CTA, or Corporate Transparency Act, which aimed to prevent the use of shell companies to launder or hide illicit funds by imposing, for the first time, a federal requirement to identify beneficial owners of certain companies. The CTA was intended to streamline industry compliance, increase transparency, and make it easier for small businesses to access banking services, while also making critical improvements to national security. Given the significance of these reforms and their considerable impact on banks, small businesses, and other reporting companies, it is critical that we efficiently implement these changes while minimizing the burden on affected industry. That is why Democrats strongly support robust funding for FinCEN to ensure it has resources it needs to swiftly and properly implement CTA. By contrast, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have proposed substantial budget cuts to FinCEN and other offices at Treasury charged with protecting our national security. I'm going to say that again, protecting our national security. The proposed cuts would reduce current funding levels by approximately 22% and would require the office to lay off 19% of the personnel. I cannot fathom the logic of slashing funds from an office that is in the midst of implementing a major policy overhaul pertaining to United States national security. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that today's hearing is an important discussion about certain flaws in FinCEN's beneficial ownership rulemaking that deviate from the intent of Congress. But I am concerned about the loopholes in draft filing form that undermines the effectiveness of law, as well as proposals to greatly restrict access to the BO1 database, which would render new rules practically useless. I also agree that FinCEN must do better to provide outreach and education to small businesses to ensure compliance with the law. These drastic budget cuts will serve only to slow implementation of the CTA, weaken FinCEN's ability to pursue bad actors, and ultimately jeopardize our national security. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record two statements from FACT, the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition, and one from CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington.
Without objection.
Both of these articles will reinforce my testimony. Thank you once again to our witnesses, and I certainly look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, a gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first commend the administration on the appointment of Andrea Gacke as the new director of FinCEN. This is welcome news, and I'm hopeful it marks a turning point for the agency. 2 Congresses ago, lawmakers came together to pass the Financial Transparency Act. The intention was to safeguard our financial system from bad actors while alleviating burdensome and duplicative reporting requirements. Unfortunately, the Biden administration's proposed beneficial ownership regime is not consistent with congressional intent. The Treasury Department has made the final rule as complicated as possible, altering timelines, definitions, and even failing to put together a simple filing form. It's clear that if changes are not made, Congress must act to delay the rulemaking's effective date. I look forward to working with incoming Director Gacke to address our concerns and members of this subcommittee in coordination with the administration. This is a very important item for businesses across America and millions of Americans that will have to comply with these new regs. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your leadership, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We have a minute for the ranking member, but she apparently is not here. With that, we'll move on to the introduction of our guests today. And we thank each of them for coming. First, we have Kevin Kuhlman. Mr. Kuhlman is the Vice President of Federal Government Relations at National Federation of Independent Business, NFIB. Mr. Kuhlman leads the NFIB Federal Government Relations team, guiding policy priorities and directing the organization's federal advocacy efforts. Welcome. Next, we have Jim Richards. Mr. Richards is the founder and principal of RegTech Consulting, LLC. Prior to forming RegTech Consulting in 2018, Mr. Richards was Executive Vice President, the Bank Secrecy Act BSA Officer, and Global Director of Financial Crimes Risk Management for Wells Fargo and Company for 13 years, and AML Operations Executive at Bank of America. Welcome, Mr. Richards. Next, we have Mr. Pete Selenke. Mr. Selenke serves as Vice President, Anti-Money Laundering Bank Secrecy Act Officer for the Central Trust Bank, a privately held $19 billion bank headquartered in Jefferson City, Missouri, in my district. Mr. Selenke has over 32 years of experience in the Bank Secrecy Act compliance. Mr. Selenke, welcome. Next, we have Mr. Kalman. Mr. Kalman is the Executive Director of Transparency International U.S. He oversees the organization's U.S. operations, focusing on illicit finance and the U.S. role in global anti-corruption efforts. Welcome, Mr. Kalman. We thank each of you taking time to be here. Mr. Richards flew in from California, and Mr. Selenke from Missouri, we're excited to have them both here, all four. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. I would ask each of you, those microphones in front of you, move. Make sure that you pull them as close as possible. We have somebody trying to transcribe this, and if they can't hear it, it can't be transcribed. So the microphones are very sensitive, but you have to get right on top of them. So if you'd be willing to pull those things forward to you, it would be great. Mr. Kuhlman, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks. You may begin.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Luke DeMeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, Chairman McHenry, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Kevin Kuhlman with the National Federation of Independent Business. NFIB has long opposed beneficial ownership information, or BOI, reporting requirements because the regulations disproportionately impact small businesses under the threat of severe penalties. NFIB believes the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, has overreached in implementing the legislation, failing both to minimize reporting burdens and provide clarity to small businesses. Few small businesses are aware of their requirements that begin in less than 6 months, and FinCEN is lacking in education and outreach to the small business community, and I appreciate everyone for recognizing that. The Corporate Transparency Act was inserted as a House amendment into an unrelated and must-pass bill, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2021. It never received a standalone vote in the Senate. Burying the provision in a large bill contributed to the lack of awareness of the requirements. The Corporate Transparency Act requires small businesses with 20 or fewer employees and less than $5 million in revenue to file periodic reports containing personally identifiable information with FinCEN. Failure to file completed and updated reports could result in civil penalties up to $10,000 and criminal penalties up to 2 years in prison. It is one of the most expansive small business regulations in history, affecting 32.6 million small businesses in the first year and 6 million small businesses every year thereafter, according to FinCEN's estimates. The cost of this regulation is a staggering $23 billion in the first year and $6 billion per year moving forward. It was the costliest final regulation issued in 2022. FinCEN failed to minimize burdens on reporting companies. Congress instructed the Secretary of Treasury when prescribing regulations to adhere to 3 directives. A, seek to minimize burdens on reporting companies. B, provide clarity to reporting companies concerning identification of their beneficial owners. And C, collect information that is highly useful to national security. NFIB believes FinCEN repeatedly failed to balance these statutory directives, often disregarding the first 2 intended to minimize burdens and provide clarity to small businesses. NFIB believes strongly that FinCEN overreached on the first rulemaking, which defines who must report, what information they must report, and by when they must report that information. Regarding who must report, FinCEN should have adopted or could have adopted a simpler definition of beneficial owner. such as the existing definitions in the customer due diligence rule, which requires a maximum of 5 individuals to report their BOI. Instead, FinCEN broadly expanded definitions, which will result in employees with no ownership interest being swept into reporting. These definitions go beyond congressional intent and create compliance difficulty. Regarding what information must be reported, the statute only requires 4 pieces of information: full legal name, date of birth, current residential or business address, and a unique identifying number from an acceptable ID document or a FinCEN identifier. The final rule mandates small businesses report personal information beyond this that is not explicitly required in the statute, including tax identification information, either an employer identification number, a taxpayer identification number, or a Social Security number, and scanned copies of their driver's licenses or passports. As a result, the draft application has 50 questions and spans 8 pages. Timing of reports. NFIB is concerned that FinCEN ignored congressional intent when dictating timelines. FinCEN failed to minimize reporting burdens on small businesses by accelerating these timelines. For initial reporting, they chose 1 year instead of the allowable 2 years. For updated reporting, they chose 30 days instead of the allowable 1 year. And for corrected reporting, they chose 30 days instead of the allowable 90 days. FinCEN consistently rejected lengthening these timelines as permitted by the statute, citing national security reasons. Very few small businesses are aware of these requirements, which begin in less than 6 months on January 1st, 2024. Most small business owners are unfamiliar with FinCEN, and receiving a notice in the mail a few weeks before they must file may be disregarded as a potential scam. After all, as recently as July 3rd, the IRS issued a scam warning for taxpayers for an official-looking envelope requesting very similar personal information, including scanned photos of their driver's license. FinCEN is required to issue a small business compliance guide under the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Act, Fairness Act. NFIB urges FinCEN to make this guide available and accessible as quickly as possible. In addition, FinCEN should issue guidance to provide clarity on exactly what types of entities must file BOI reports. There is still ambiguity whether certain sole proprietorships and general partnerships must file reports. I included some legislative recommendations in my written testimony. NFIB would welcome the opportunity to work with members of this committee to provide relief from the most problematic requirements of the BOI reporting. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Gentleman's time's expired. Mr. Richards, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lukemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, distinguished members of the subcommittee, and thank you for the invitation to appear before you today to discuss the potential consequences of FinCEN's beneficial ownership rulemaking. My perspective is that of someone who's been in the anti-money laundering field since the 1990s. I welcomed the AML Act as an opportunity to get back to what should be the singular purpose of our anti-money laundering laws, and that is protecting the financial system by providing timely, actionable intelligence to law enforcement in an efficient, effective, and secure way. And I welcomed the Corporate Transparency Act as an opportunity to improve how we were collecting and using beneficial ownership information. The practical implications of FinCEN's beneficial ownership rulemaking will be felt by 35 million small businesses, more than 16,000 financial institutions, and more than 400 law enforcement agencies. More than 60 million Americans will have their personal information and copies of their driver's license or passport in a centralized database run by FinCEN, an agency few of those 60 million have ever heard of. But FinCEN is struggling to promulgate the rules needed to implement the AMLA and the CTA. FinCEN has published none of the 9 rules needed to implement the AML Act and has only published 1 of the 3 rules to implement the Corporate Transparency Act. And those rules that are proposed and finalized often go beyond congressional intent, and many are stunningly complex. If the reason why FinCEN is struggling to meet its mandate is, in fact, resource constraints, then FinCEN would be doing the opposite of what it is currently doing. It would be putting out simple rules, adhering to congressional intent, and publicly acknowledging that it must keep things simple since it doesn't have the resources to do anything else. The potential positive consequences of FinCEN's beneficial ownership rulemaking, done right, are far-reaching. If we get this right, all this rulemaking and guidance and access and reporting will demonstrably and measurably reduce money laundering and financial crime, if we get it right. But with continuing resource constraints and required rulemakings remaining incomplete and no practical guidance to 35 million small businesses, we are not going to get it right on January 1st, 2024. America needs the Corporate Transparency Act to succeed, but success cannot be achieved by a rushed deployment of complex rules that go well beyond congressional intent. Too many of FinCEN's rules and proposed rules are aspirational without being practical. We're deputizing 35 million small businesses and asking 60 million Americans to step up to contribute their most prized information. FinCEN cannot rush in half-cocked. We need to start simple, start strong, whether that is January 1st, 2024, 2025, or 2026. We can adapt as needed over time, but we need to get it right out of the gate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Richard. Recognize Mr. Selenke for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lutemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding potential consequences of FinCEN's beneficial ownership rulemaking. My name is Pete Selenke, and I serve as Vice President and Anti-Money Laundering Bank Secrecy Act Officer for the Central Trust Bank, a mid-sized bank established in 1902 and headquartered in Jefferson City, Missouri. We directly serve customers in 9 states and at more than 150 locations. Today, I am pleased to speak on behalf of Central Bank and our nearly 3,000 employees, as well as the American Bankers Association, whose members include small, mid-size, regional, large banks, and who together employ more than 2 million people. As a banker with more than 32 years' experience in Bank Secrecy Act compliance, I'm personally and deeply committed to protecting the U.S. financial system, our bank, and our bank customers from threats posed by bad actors. And I have seen firsthand the success and challenges of operationalizing BSA regulations. Thanks to hard work of my team of 20 BSA compliance professionals at Central Bank, I am proud to report that we have received 2 awards from FinCEN in recognition for our work in assisting law enforcement in the past 5 years. The banking industry has changed dramatically over the past 50 years, and so have threats posed by bad actors. To combat these evolving threats, the ABA strongly supported the enactment of both the Anti-Money Laundering Act and the Corporate Transparency Act, which together reflect a consensus among bankers, lawmakers, and regulators on the need to modernize our nation's Bank Secrecy Act rules so that the resources dedicated by banks can even more effectively and efficiently support law enforcement's work to prevent 21st century financial crime and terrorism. The reforms embodied in these laws carefully balance a number of important priorities, including banks must know who our customers are. Law enforcement needs tools to identify criminals who use and exploit shell companies to commit their crimes. The burden to the public must be minimalized, including the cost borne by financial institutions eager to support law enforcement, and Americans' privacy rights must be protected. As BSA AML professionals, my colleagues and I have dedicated our careers to defending the integrity of the U.S. financial system from bad actor and protecting our customers. We want nothing more than for AMLA and CTA to achieve Congress's goals, and that is why it is so important that FinCEN promulgates regulations to implement these reforms in a manner that is consistent with congressional intent. To that end, there are 3 areas where FinCEN must focus when creating a meaningful beneficial ownership regime: use, accuracy, and education. Use. Banks need to be able to use the information in the beneficial ownership registry to support broader BSA AML program requirements. FinCEN's proposed limitations on banks' ability to use this information to only support customer due diligence, program compliance, not broader BSA AML compliance, are inconsistent with congressional intent, and these restrictions will increase banks' burdens instead of reducing them. 2, accuracy. The beneficial ownership registry must be a reliable and authoritative source of information. The federal government must make sure the information in the registry is accurate. This responsibility should not be imposed on those seeking to access the database. If the accuracy of the registry's information is in doubt, banks may not be able to use the database at all. Education. We will help where we can, but Congress did not delegate the responsibility of informing the public of beneficial ownership reporting requirements to banks. The federal government needs to educate the public about the new legal obligations to report beneficial ownership information, especially when there are serious penalties for noncompliance. My colleagues and I have dedicated our careers to defending the integrity of the U.S. financial system from bad actors and protecting our customers. We look forward to working with the dedicated professionals at FinCEN to make these rules work for law enforcement, for banks, and for our customers. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Selenke. Mr. Kalman, recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Luke DeMeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, and distinguished members of the committee. On behalf of Transparency International US, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss progress towards the implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act, a foundational reform to combat transnational crime and corruption. We're part of the world's largest and oldest coalition dedicated to fighting corruption. We want to thank the leadership of the Financial Services Committee for working in a bipartisan fashion to enact the CTA. Today, more than 100 countries have followed suit, adopted, and have pledged to adopt similar reforms to help protect the integrity of our global financial system. In the lead up to the passage of the CTA, the committee heard a litany of examples how anonymous corporate structures were used to facilitate the flow of illicit finance. For example, a Global Witness report called Hidden Menace found that in one case, a U.S. company contracted to supply services to troops in Afghanistan was secretly owned by interests associated with the Taliban. The United States government was literally supplying funds that could be used to purchase guns and other weapons aimed at our troops. These reports are why nearly 100 civilian and former military national security experts signed a letter to Congress in support of the collection of beneficial ownership information. Alarmingly, these stories are part of a larger collection of threats that go beyond anecdotes. According to a 2011 study by the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, anonymous companies were used to hide the proceeds of corruption in 70% of grand corruption cases reviewed, with U.S. entities being the most common. To address these harms and many others, Congress appropriately included the CTA in the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. There are several parts of the rulemakings to date that FinCEN produced in a way that captures both the plain text of the law and the purpose for which it was intended. We believe definitions are true to the statute and consistent with emerging global norms. The exemptions were tailored to avoid unintended gaps or loopholes that bad actors might exploit. However, I will highlight at least 5 provisions in the proposed rules I'll mention here that raise substantial concerns. First, the proposed rule invents significant new barriers to access by state, local, and tribal law enforcement that have no basis in the CTA. Such requirements were considered and rejected by congressional drafters, as the requirements would create new obstacles to investigations without any clear benefits. Second, FinCEN's additional requirements for foreign access also have no basis in the text of the CTA. They would create unnecessary double standard and will result in significant practical barriers for trusted allies. Third, Restrictions on the use of the information by financial institutions exclude from using the information for the entire range of AML checks. Without fixing this, the database as a whole may prove simply non-functional to the thousands of financial institutions across the United States. Fourth, while thankfully withdrawn, a proposed reporting form had included a checkbox for filers to include the information was unknown. Such a box would at best confuse reporting companies as to their obligations under the law, and at worst provide opportunities for evasion. Fifth, the database will only be as useful as it is accurate. Automated real-time verification of beneficial ownership information would provide a minimum level of assurance that the information is accurate and reliable. FinCEN must better communicate what it needs to adequately verify the information. We join some of the frustration by many in this committee regarding the delays in the finalizing of CTA rules. However, myriad threats to national security and global security demands a strong, well-resourced U.S. financial intelligence unit. In a 2022 report, my organization found that FinCEN's budget and staffing levels were similar to that of its counterpart in Australia, a country with an economy 1/15 the size that of the United States. There is a powerful argument that additional funds are needed for FinCEN to fully and effectively do what we ask the Bureau. If an increase in general funding for FinCEN is not possible at this time, perhaps agreement on targeted funding is achievable to address the mutually agreed upon frustrations discussed at this hearing. The importance of setting up the database, establishing proper verification systems, and education and outreach to key stakeholders are areas where members have found common ground. Thank you for the opportunity to share my views at this hearing, and I look forward to working with this committee to address these important issues.
Thank you, Mr. Kalman, and thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Excellent job. All came within the 5 minutes, so thank you for that. We'll now turn to member questions, and the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questioning. Mr. Selenke, welcome. I know you are the banker of the group, and you're the one that's going to have to implement these new rules from the FinCEN folks. How does it feel to be an employee of FinCEN?
Chairman Luetmeyer, I do appreciate the statement. It is, as a bank representative, we want to do what we can to support. And it is a challenge right now. As you said, it's a challenge right now, so we'll
I know it's frustrating, you know, you're basically deputized here to collect information for law enforcement purposes, which you're not a law enforcement officer, you're a banker. You're hoping to help people grow their personal finances, their businesses, in this situation, businesses, and yet you're in the middle of this law enforcement situation. So it's got to be frustrating. Has FinCEN talked to you at all with regards to how they're going to roll this out? What kind of rules and regulations? Are you still in the dark?
Chairman Luetmeyer, we currently have not seen any information on how to roll it out, what information will be needed.
Less than 6 months to go, and we still are in the dark. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Mr. Richard, you talked a lot about the goings-on of FinCEN. Why are we less than 6 months from rolling this out and still not here? Is it that they want to minimize our ability to have oversight, so they're trying to delay it? Are they just incompetent? Or are they just not capable of rolling these rules out? Or what's the problem?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't know what the problem might be. And I said in my testimony that if it was a funding issue, they would be doing the opposite of what they're currently doing.
Right.
Simple rules, getting them out, communicating out properly. It remains a black box and a mystery as to what they're doing, what they're not doing, and they're simply not communicating.
So everybody's in the dark here in more ways than one. Very concerned about the compliance on this. Mr. Kuhlman, you made some, in your written testimony, I think in your verbal testimony, you made mention of the fact that we got over 32.6 million small businesses. The result of this regulation is staggering $22.7 billion the first year, $5.6 billion moving forward for compliance. That's staggering. Did FinCEN or our CBO or anybody do a cost-benefit analysis on this rule before it was issued, to your knowledge?
CBO assumed, it was kind of it's a whole new universe, right? We're using state definitions for federal law, limited liability companies, corporations, or similar entities, which was pretty vague. And CBO estimated 25 to 30. FinCEN's estimates have increased every time they've put out an estimate, and it's just because it's a new world. Nobody really knows, and until we either eliminate certain businesses, sole proprietors or partnerships, or say that they're in, it's kind of this, we're still in ambiguity at this point in time and uncertainty. So there have been some estimates, they've been kind of all over the place, but they've only increased over time.
Okay, you're an advocate for small businesses. What's a better way to do this? Would you, if you were designing a program, how would you do it? Rather than have the banks be the collector of the information, would it be simple for FinCEN to come to the banks and say, we have a problem with a certain business, and right now the process is go get a warrant, go to the bank and get the information? What's wrong with that process?
Right, historically it's been targeted at banks or real estate transactions, and it has had some sort of protection with the subpoena for an investigation. So there's been kind of the criticism, as I understand it from financial institutions, you have a big haystack and you're looking for needles and it may not be impactful. My criticism of this regulation is you're just making that haystack even bigger and trying to find those same needles. So a more targeted approach I think would be better if you are doing something like this. I thought Congressman French Hill's idea of updating the employer identification number form, the form SS4, would have been better, a little bit more protected at IRS. But we have what we have now.
You know, to me, this is like if, whenever you're, for instance, FinCEN's going after somebody who's making bombs and they use fertilizer to make the bombs. So you go to the hardware store, every time somebody buys fertilizer, you got to send information to FinCEN. I mean, this is how over the top this situation is. People's private information, businesses' private information are going to be on a government server, and the government has proved over and over again it cannot be a good steward of that information. This is nuts. I'll yield back the balance of my time and go to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, who is the ranking member of the Full Financial Services Committee, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm directing this question to Mr. Kalman and Mr. Selenke. You have both described a number of serious deficiencies in the notices of proposed rulemakings related to Corporate Transparency Act. Would these problems with the draft rulemaking text be solved by reducing FinCEN's budget from $229 million requested by the Biden administration for fiscal year 2024 to only $166 million, the astonishing low amount provided by House Republicans in their recently marked up financial services and general government appropriations bill? Mr. Kalman?
Thank you, Chairwoman, for the question. I think we have seen that FinCEN's, from the report that my organization did and some other places, that FinCEN is, in our mind, underfunded. I do think that the rulemaking process would certainly not be helped by a budget cut. I'm not convinced that the rule writings problems are necessarily funding related, although to the extent that they are also trying to build the database at the same time and make sure that the rules and the database and the filing systems are all working in sync, then that would be a funding issue, and to make sure that they're able to have the resources to build the database and make sure that it all matches and it will be a seamless implementation. So I do believe that for the database and for very specific pieces of this rulemaking process, the funding is necessary.
Mr. Selenke?
Yes.
The question is, what do you think about the fact that the Biden budget was $229 million requested, and the Republicans have marked up legislation that would only provide $166 million. That's an astonishing low amount that's provided by House Republicans in the recently marked up financial services and central government appropriation bill. What do you think about that cut?
Congressman Walters.
I can't hear you.
I apologize, Congressman. Oh, there we go. Congressman Walters, I apologize. From a banking perspective and my perspective as a BSA officer, I really don't have an opinion on that one because our experience with FinCEN has been very helpful for us, and I don't think I'm in a position to really speak to that.
I would not expect you perhaps to know about the exact amounts that would be needed, but the question becomes, do they need substantial, credible resources in order to take care of the problem of the deficiencies in the notices of proposed rulemaking related to Corporate Transparency Act? Do they need personnel to do that? Do they need staff to do that? Do they need money to do that? And does it seem curious to you that the administration would ask for $229 million only to be responded to with $166 million? You have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, Congressman Walters, I will say, in concurring with Mr. Kalman, as he said earlier, I think there is room and for discussion and where efficiencies can be found. So, I mean, as you said, their resources are needed, and that determination is to be made.
So could I conclude this by saying that resources are important and they're needed in order to do the job? Does that make good sense?
Congressman Walters, that would be an accurate statement.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Kalman?
I certainly would.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman that yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from the great state of Texas, Mr. Williams, who is chairman of the Small Business Committee, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all of you. My main concern with FinCEN's additional beneficial ownership reporting requirements is the immense burden these increased requirements will have on small businesses. Many small businesses, of which I am one in Texas, owners are facing higher costs and possible penalties for this rule coming out of FinCEN, which is a bureau not all businesses are familiar with. There are over 32 million small businesses in the United States, yet FinCEN has not laid out a strategic plan to inform business owners of how they can be sure they are reporting all the correct information. I want to thank the chairman for attaching my bill to today's hearing, the Small Business Working Group Act, which will provide an opportunity for small businesses to learn about beneficial ownership and promote coordination between FinCEN and Main Street America. We need to give small businesses the opportunity to learn the rules of the road, let them comply and what exactly all this information means and entails. So, Mr. Kuhlman, what conversations have you had with FinCEN regarding beneficial ownership reporting requirements, and do you feel as if their outreach to small business regarding this rule has been sufficient?
We had one conversation with FinCEN in the summer of 2021. I believe it was after they put out their advance notice of proposed rulemaking, but before they put out any of the first two proposed rules. But have had no, we've filed comments at every opportunity we have, but we've had no subsequent conversations. And I'm afraid you're right that there will not be, that many of the impacted businesses are unprepared or aware of the requirements that are forthcoming.
Yeah, we need the rules to play by the rules.
Absolutely.
Secondly, throughout 2022, more than 2,000 people died from fentanyl in Texas alone, and which is more than 5 people per day. Trafficking of fentanyl and its ingredients are conducted by a wide range of Chinese criminal actors. Organized crime networks like those used by the Chinese can operate outside of local jurisdictions through the establishment of shell companies. Now, these shell companies serve as a front for drug trafficking operations. The congressional intent for the CTE was to strengthen national security by providing tools to identify all shell companies used for money laundering, drug trafficking, and terrorist financing. I have some concerns with the direction the BOI rulemaking is taking and the impacts it will have on national security if it is not implemented correctly. So, Mr. Richards, given your impressive career in combating financial crimes, how can an effective BOI rulemaking help law enforcement stop money laundering, and how has FinCEN misinterpreted congressional intent in their current BOI rulemaking?
Your first question, Congressman. Nothing in the beneficial ownership rule is going to stop money laundering or fight financial crime unless the information gets into the hands of law enforcement. And then law enforcement can take action on it. That's the most critical thing. And there, again, there's nothing in the rulemaking that compels that information to be used. Now, there are provisions in the AML Act which requires the Department of Justice and GAO to do some studies on the effectiveness of the BSA reporting. But without that, we're not going to succeed.
Yeah.
Your second question was around how far FinCEN's strayed from congressional intent, I believe. I believe they did it in 4 ways, at least 4 ways. First, they created a regime where there's 3 rules instead of 2. I think the plain reading of the AML Act and the Corporate Transparency Act called for 2 rules, and 3 rules might be like, what's the difference at the end of the day? Well, the difference is that 3 rules adds a level of complexity and time because of the rulemaking process that we don't really have. I mean, that's one of the resources FinCEN hasn't talked about is time, and they are running out of time. The 3 other areas where I believe FinCEN went beyond congressional intent are having multiple control persons. There's not a law enforcement officer in the world who's ever burst into a room and said, how many of you are in charge? They walk in and they say, who is in charge? And yet, that's what the CTA impliedly called for. And yet, FinCEN has said, no, we can have multiple control persons. That is beyond congressional intent and adds a level of complexity that's not needed out of the gate. Third is having the images of the identification documents. I think that's a stretch. It might be valuable 2 years down the road once FinCEN has sort of tested and piloted this process, but doing it out of the gate, I think goes beyond congressional intent and adds a level of complexity that's not needed. And finally is, and Pete talked about it, is the limited use of the beneficial ownership information. I apologize for the long answer.
Yield my time back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we recognize the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, who is the ranking member of this committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the witnesses here. Let me start with you, Mr. Kalman. We've been talking a lot about rulemaking, and as I believe you were part of the Bipartisan Corporate Transparency Act, took over 10 years to pass it. It's my understanding that you met with members and staff frequently as a part of that process to talk about the practicalities about how the law was ultimately shaped. Can you talk a little bit more about how important this legislation was and the prevalence of the use of shell companies to laundry money, and how pivotal this legislation was to protect our national security?
Thank you for the question. It did take over 10 years. I believe it was 12 years since Senator Carl Levin first introduced the bill. It was negotiated with numerous amendments and different versions of the bill through several administrations. During those years, I think there was more and more evidence that came to light that I think helped move the process forward, and that showed that it was really truly a national security issue. And let me just give one example, and I don't want to take too much time, but I think one of the early examples that was pretty shocking to this committee and to others was when we discovered that the Iranian government had bought an office tower on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan to evade our sanctions. And just to think about that, the easiest place on the planet for Iran to evade our economic sanctions was to buy property in New York. I think that says a lot about the use of anonymous companies and how they can help to circumvent our efforts at national and global security.
And even with that, Mr. Kalman, I think what's important for me, because we're in a new era of time with FinCEN, and we all have some questions and what's the intent of the Congress, but I think the operative thing with me, in addition to that case, was the bipartisanship and the broad coalition of stakeholders. So here we are again now as we are talking about FinCEN. Can you talk about that bipartisanship?
I think that was one of the reasons that helped move the legislation forward.
Can you say that part again?
I think that the bipartisan or across the political spectrum support for the bill was what helped move it forward and help members to understand the value. We had think tanks on both the right and the left. We had, at the end, the Chamber of Commerce came aboard, as well as having a number of environmental groups. The banks were a good partner with consumer groups. We had law enforcement and civil rights organizations, a number of organizations that you don't normally see on legislation at the same time. So that was, I think that was a critical, and I hope a good reminder to the committee about how this moved forward.
Thank you. Our strength certainly was in our unity. Let me shift with the few minutes I have left. We've heard a lot about small businesses. I, too, for more than 2 decades, served as a small business in my district. And there are a lot of concerns about these reporting requirements. And so I'm sensitive to regulatory changes that will impose burdens and compliance costs on small businesses. Can you give us a sense of projected compliance for costs for small businesses, or do you have any data on estimates for this? Or anyone?
Yeah, I'll just offer, and then if others have, the only practical experience I think that was looked at that we saw was in the United Kingdom after they passed their law, and they looked at various businesses and how much it costs. And I think the initial costs for average small businesses, they define those as businesses less than 50 employees. Our law is less than 20 employees. Was about, I believe, $150 the first year, and then the annual sort of upkeep cost, they self-reported by businesses, came out to be £2, which would be about $2.50 a year. So while we do appreciate that this is something that businesses have to pay attention to, and it's another regulation in a lot of regulations, this particular regulation we don't think is actually going to cost a significant amount of money.
I don't have enough time for you to probably answer, but my last question was going to be to everyone if there's anything concrete that the Congress can do to help FinCEN further ease business compliance, but you can send that in writing. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, who's the chairman of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Important hearing, and really appreciate the witnesses' testimony about FinCEN's overreach here. I am worried about FinCEN's significant deviation from congressional intent, and I just spoke to the Kentucky Bankers Association, and they are concerned. Their customers don't understand what's coming. They don't understand 1071 on that data collection, and they don't understand what's about to hit the small businesses with this CTA. And again, definite deviation from congressional intent when finalizing and implementing the BOI reporting rule, and that will mean trouble for small businesses' ability to comply. The CTA states that reporting from existing companies needs to be conducted no later than 2 years after enactment, yet FinCEN's final rule requires reporting 1 year from finalization of the rule. So it's one thing that they've got 50 questions and 8 pages. It's another thing that they're going to, when no small business knows this is coming, it's that they've expedited the timeline. So, Mr. Kuhlman, what does this expedited timeline mean for small businesses, and will your members have time to comply?
For existing businesses that only have the 1 year to comply, it's what's most obviously just half the time that they were permitted to do it. But it's also that those businesses don't know that it exists, so it's going to take them time to do it. When are they going to be able to meet with their tax professional or whatever is probably in the spring, right? So there goes 3 months. And then to maybe go back and try to find who are their beneficial owners, if it's a multi-generation business or something like that. Fortunately, existing businesses don't have to go back and find the applicant, who may be long gone by that point in time, but that's a problem. I'm even more concerned about the businesses formed after the effective date, though, because they only have 30 days to get all this information, and they're basically overwhelmed with starting up this business and being stressful at that point in time. So they're going to have to track this down. They're going to have to get employer identification number and taxpayer identification. They might not even have that information in time, but this is certainly the last thing on their mind.
Yeah, certainly requirements to disclose things they don't have to in the statute, and I am worried that FinCEN will fail to roll out a final rule rescinding the CDD rule, forcing a duplicative reporting regime upon the backs of small businesses. Mr. Richards, when Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act, were there 3 separate bills, or did we enact just one?
Well, it was the one bill, but three separate rules I think you're
Yeah.
referring to.
And so, sorry about the queued question, but that, you anticipated my next, which is, how did we end up with three separate rulemakings with only one statute?
It was a surprise. The section that rolled out the Corporate Transparency Act was titled Beneficial Ownership Information Reporting Requirements. It included both reporting and access.
Yeah.
Another section has GAO and Treasury doing studies on the beneficial ownership information reporting requirements. FinCEN's advance notice of proposed rulemaking was on beneficial ownership information reporting requirements, and it included both reporting and access. So when they came out with the 3-rule approach instead of the 2-rule approach, I think it took everybody by surprise.
And do three separate rules lend themselves to creating a simple, straightforward reporting regime?
No, they add complexity and add time.
Well, I share our chairman's sentiment that Ms. Gatke will be a good addition to FinCEN, and we look forward to working with FinCEN and appreciate FinCEN's offer to come to our districts and help educate our small business community about these new requirements. But we look forward to working with FinCEN's new leadership and retooling what they've done here. Mr. Richards, final question in my remaining time. Fraud and other forms of criminal behavior are on the rise. Your bank customers have been educated in part to be careful with whom they share their sensitive personal information, in part to protect them against fraud and exploitation. Do you anticipate that the customers are going to require education from FinCEN to feel comfortable sharing this sensitive personal identifying information with FinCEN, in addition to giving your bank written consent in order to access the beneficial ownership registry?
Absolutely. And that's the one thing that the businesses don't have, is how to do this. They don't know how to do it. I'm a small business. I know a little bit about this stuff. I know I'm not going to be registering until about November because I want to make sure that this database is secure.
Yeah, and Mr. Richards, excellent point about none of this is going to advance the cause of law enforcement, anti-money laundering, countering terror finance, or national security. None of it's going to advance any of those things if it doesn't get into the hands of law enforcement. This is the frustration, frankly, with a lot of my small community banks related to CTRs and SARS, is they never get any feedback. Is this helping or not? So with that, I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nickel. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lukemeyer and Ranking Member Beatty, and thanks to our witnesses for being here. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, is our country's financial intelligence unit, meaning it's providing intelligence that helps the U.S. to achieve its national security objectives. This includes intelligence used to track, seize, and freeze Russian oligarch funds that are fueling the war in Ukraine and funds used to traffic Chinese fentanyl. My colleagues across the aisle have proposed cutting FinCEN's budget, rolling back the FY24 appropriation to $166 million. That's $63 million below the administration's budget request. With fewer resources, FinCEN will have a harder time supporting such national security and law enforcement inquiries while moving forward on structural reform to strengthen the U.S. financial system against illicit funds. Mr. Kalman, if we cut funding for FinCEN, what are the potential negative consequences to our ability to fight financial crime?
Thank you for the question. There's many impacts. I will say, let me just say this one, which I think we all agree on this panel, is that one of the key things, one of the most important things about this, getting this right and making sure that it's effective, is if the data is verified, if that we know that the information that's in the database is accurate. And we've heard from Pete that, you know, if it's not accurate, they won't find it useful and won't use it. So verification costs money. They need licenses to access other databases. They need to be able to make sure that their systems are compatible. That takes a lot of money, and that is not currently in the FinCEN's budget. And so we do think that in general they need more money, but specifically, if this rule is going to work, they need to have that targeted funding.
Mr. Kalman, how would the Republicans' proposed budget cuts impact FinCEN's ability to engage with stakeholders of the Corporate Transparency Act to ensure that the small business community can more easily and accurately comply with these new rules?
So FinCEN does need to be able to reach out both to, well, actually to number of stakeholders. It's the small businesses, as have been mentioned before, that's critical. Making sure that they can pick up the phone and answer questions from the banks once the financial institutions have to engage in this rule. They also have to deal with the secretaries of state and others that have corporate formation at the state level to make sure that it's as seamless as possible when businesses do go to register a business. And so that outreach is going to cost money and take additional personnel.
And I've got some more questions, but Ranking Member Beatty was on to something that I wanted to hear from everyone on the panel on. Thought it was a great question, so I want to just take her question and pose the question to all four of you. Is there anything concrete that Congress can do to help FinCEN to further ease business compliance?
Well, Congressman Nickel and Congresswoman Beatty, Congress, I think, in the original intent of this rule was to create something that was simple, accurate, and accessible, especially to law enforcement as well as to financial institutions. And I think ensuring that that request or that expectation is completed is what Congress can assist in.
Ms. Richards?
I'll repeat that. Congress can help FinCEN help itself by keeping things simple, by easing the burden on financial institutions, particularly expanding their ability to use this information for all purposes, including investigating and reporting suspicious activity, and encouraging law enforcement to use it. I think you just have to work with them, and I think under the new director, I think that's very, very possible.
Mr. Kuhlman?
Yeah, I think revisiting some of the definitions, as Mr. Richards mentioned, that substantial control was supposed to be one person. FinCEN, an example, listed up to 8 people. I think even, so looking at definitions, beneficial owner, substantial control, perhaps limiting those, perhaps limiting or eliminating the or similar entities from LLC and corporation, because that's kind of been wide open and expansive as well. And then taking a look at the timeline. I believe Congressman Nunn has a bill that goes back to the original timeline. On the comment on the bipartisanship earlier, I tend to agree that the bipartisanship did give kind of those expanded timelines, and a lot of that bipartisanship was just eliminated in the regulation when they were just limited to more restrictive than anything that was suggested in earlier pieces of legislation.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Georgia. Mr. Loudermilk is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Very important hearing. And before I start with my questions, I want to touch on something that Representative Barr actually touched on, is with current regulations dealing with the Bank Secrecy Act. Before I get into that, I think the big issue that most of us are looking at is that Congress was very intentional when we drafted legislation for FinCEN, and it seems like FinCEN's ignored most of those guidelines in the final product. Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to insert a letter from the National Association of Manufacturers which highlights multiple areas where FinCEN has subverted or exceeded congressional intent in rulemaking and have put thousands of small businesses at risk of incompliance.
Without objection.
And with that, I want to make sure to get that out of the way. I want to go back to what Mr. Barr talked about with the SARs and CTRs. Even though this is about beneficial ownership, I'm working on legislation to modernize the currency transactions and suspicious activity reports. And Mr. Selenke, I heard that you have a unique perspective on the issue, and I was hoping that you would maybe briefly share your thoughts on raising or simplifying the thresholds for those reports. I come from an intelligence background in the military, and there's a couple of issues I see with CTRs and SARs. One, the threshold is so low on CTRs that if we were to adjust it for inflation, we would go from the 1970s $10,000 to over $80,000 today. But because we're overwhelming the system with information, because of the CTR threshold being so low, and the lack of clear definition on what is a suspicious activity, we find that banks, to avoid making mistake or having someone come after them, they'll just report most anything. So what happens to law enforcement is like looking for a needle in the haystack. I want to reduce the haystack so we get to the information. The second is the federal government becomes the biggest data risk of anybody in the United States. And so you have all this financial data that's sitting in a database that most people are not using but becomes subjective to disclosure. And so, again, if you could enlighten us with your ideas and thoughts on this.
I appreciate the question, Congressman Loudermilk. Two things. First, we'll address CTRs. The dollar amount, I think, is a good question. I think when it first came out in the early 70s, I remember my parents' first house was $13,000. So it gets a feel for the size and scope of that. But from a bank's perspective, two things, or the thing on the CTRs that would help most is to simplify the process. As a bank, we really do use exemptions. So if a customer regularly comes in, we will get it so that they are able to not have to fill out the paperwork. The challenge with that is, by regulation, a number of those businesses, I cannot exempt them. So it's a very complex form. The CTR form has a lot of information. I have 4 people on my staff, and that's their entire job, is to take care of CTRs. If there was a way to simplify that process to get the information that they need for law enforcement, it would make a big difference to our banking institution and banks in general. The second part you ask about is SARs. And the challenge with SARs is the way they are now. If I was able to create the rules, I would somehow bifurcate those SAR filings. Some SAR filings may be for that, I'm getting ready to buy a boat. I heard somewhere in the background, my uncle said I can't take out more than $10,000. So they take out $9,000 today, $9,000 tomorrow. I look at it, I see the money came from a Fidelity account or an investment account, and they're taking the cash out, and they told the teller they're buying a boat. I have to fill a SAR out on that. It takes the same number of boxes, et cetera, and piles on to that pile of SARs. Whereas if there's something that's more serious, that same boat dealer who was structuring those conversations, that's information that I would want to put on a SAR. So if there was a way to simplify the SAR so that information going to law enforcement wouldn't be, like you say, more haystacks and less needles, to be able to have more needles and less of a haystack.
Well, thank you. And even though this is about beneficial ownership, I see that there's some connection there, and that was very beneficial to me and where we're going. I'm running out of time, so I'll submit the rest of my questions for the record regarding beneficial ownership, but I'll close with this one thing. That always strikes me with all the information that we're getting from CTRs and SARs. If my local sheriff wanted to get that information from a financial institution, he would have to have a search warrant. If the FBI wants to get it, they just go to FinCEN and it's there. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Pedersen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kalman, in this committee and across Congress, we are very interested in the issue of fentanyl trafficking and how we can detect and deter these bad actors. Your organization, Transparency International US, developed a fact sheet that includes 10 examples of how traffickers of synthetic drugs have used shell companies to facilitate their operations and launder or hide their illicit proceeds. I'd like to submit this document for the record, and 10 examples among probably hundreds or even thousands were given here. We can add to that the human traffickers using shell companies to harm men, women, and children, arms traffickers, sanction evaders, and many others who abuse our financial system through these anonymous shell companies. So, Mr. Kalman, how would law enforcement use this database to better pursue these bad actors? And can you tell me how FinCEN can revise their proposed CTA access rule to better support such efforts?
Thank you for the question. So 2 parts to the question. How does law enforcement use this information? Let me give you one specific example. There was a study done by the anti-human trafficking organization called the Polaris Project a few years ago. They looked at 6,000 illicit massage businesses across the United States where they suspected women were being trafficked. They found in only 21% of the cases was anyone listed on the form, which meant that you had almost 80% of these businesses having no ownership. They could not arrest the people that were behind the trafficking. They could only arrest the women that were being trafficked, which seems backward to us and imperfect justice, if you will. If there was beneficial ownership information and people were required to file, they could look at that information and they can actually go to the people who were behind the trafficking operations. We believe that the way in which FinCEN has created the access rules for state and local law enforcement creates unnecessary hurdles, is not in the text of the law, and in fact goes beyond what was a very carefully negotiated compromise in making sure that there were security protections of the data, but also allowing access to the data by law enforcement. So we think that they need to update that rule. That is probably, for us, the most important piece of the problem.
Great, thank you so much. Another concern that we've heard is the cost to our businesses. My understanding is that, I guess, the barriers and the burden on businesses. 82% are non-employer businesses, so this would really just be registering the information that they have readily available. For the remaining ones that are that do have that are not just non-employer, there are, they have to collect the information. On average, we've seen in Britain, it costs on average $250 for companies like that. But for many, it's $0, and for the next year is only around $2. It seems like this is a very important investment up front to make sure that we're going after these bad actors that are not utilizing our financial system. Is there anything around, since Britain has gone years ahead of us on this, that you can point to on their success and why this is important to continue to move forward, making sure that it works for our law enforcement?
My apologies. As you noted, the vast majority of businesses are small, single-owner, non-employer firms. We also, when we were talking to our UK colleagues, they noted that it's sort of an interesting statement to say that those who can create the complex structures, that can afford the lawyers and the service providers, that can create a web of companies that make it difficult to know who owns it, then don't have the same money to be able to hire those same lawyers to figure out who's on the top of the corporate food chain. So we don't think that that's actually true, and we would challenge, and during the entire debate, we've never actually heard anybody come up with an actual real-life example of that. So we do think, again, it is a requirement for businesses, but we think that the vast majority, it's a very simple thing, and for those that are more complex, they have proven they can afford it.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I yield back.
Lady yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Mr. Muser is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses as well. It does seem as if we on this committee are a broken record. We're meeting with those where rules from the Biden administration agencies continue to go beyond congressional intent, are out of scope, and overburden businesses, particularly small businesses, and the banks that serve them. Beneficial ownership rule from FinCEN is no exception. We expressed similar concerns with the CFPB's 1071 small business data collection rule, whereby they had contract out reporting requirements, which required some very odd data at great cost to them. So FinCEN should have considered ways to minimize reporting requirements for small businesses that are already strapped with so many other unfavorable factors. FinCEN also needs to take a step back, delay implementation of their rule, and think critically about ways to move forward with Anti-Money Laundering Bank Secrecy Act compliance in a way truly beneficial to stakeholders. So my line of question is going to focus initially on small businesses who are often caught in the crossfire of such rule making. So, Mr. Kuhlman, I'd like to just start with you. To your knowledge, did FinCEN reach out to small businesses regarding how beneficial ownership rulemaking should be done in a reasonable manner for small businesses?
There has been very little outreach thus far. I think this year there's been a FAQ document that's been put on the website. That's the only update that I've heard.
And how many members in NFIB exist that would fall under this mandate of rulemaking?
80% of our members, so about 240,000 of the 300,000. But our reach is only that far and maybe not even that far, right? We got 32.6 million reports.
You think maybe there'd be a conversation and get a little bit of input, right?
Yeah.
So is the information requested by FinCEN on the reporting form, does, in your view, go beyond the original intent of Congress and the Corporate Transparency Act?
Yes, I think the definitions are too broad. The fields are more expansive than whatever. As I said, if you copy and paste it from regulations.gov, it's 8 pages. But I think AICPA or someone put together this form, which is on legal, 4 columns. I mean, this is going to cost you more than $40 or $250 to update every time. If a business owner sees this form, they're going to go to a CPA or an attorney to seek their advice.
And I imagine this is not your opinion. You are actually getting feedback from your members, and they're stating that this is going to be problematic for them.
Correct. The members as well as their advisors or tax professionals, and they all agree.
Okay. About how many of your members feel comfortable filing beneficial ownership paperwork before January 1st, 2024?
I don't know. I don't know of any, but I guess my analogy is when the customer due diligence rule became effective on May 11, 2018, I did get an influx of members who said, what is this for? And I'm not comfortable filling this out. And that had a protection. You had to stay on file at the financial institution and subpoena protection. This does not. It just goes into a giant database.
As we move forward, give us feedback, not just at this hearing, what you're hearing as well from your members, if you could do that. Mr. Selenke, I'd like to move on to you, please, how this ruling will affect banking. Why don't you just go ahead and give me some of your thoughts on what community banks, regional banks, super regionals, what their thoughts are on this ruling?
Yeah, Congressman Muser, I appreciate the question. For the mid-sized banks like myself and larger, the rule as it is currently put out there will be additive to our process. As many regulations tend to be, it could be a distraction, and focusing on this particular form, we may lose focus otherwise. Where I'm more concerned for the banks and for the small business customers is that smaller community bank in the state of Missouri, Missouri Bankers Association, many of those banks have 2 branches, 20 employees, $200 million on deposit. Their ability for their BSA officer, who is also their compliance officer, worrying about, as you said, 1071 and other rules, is going to be very difficult. So for us as a bank, I'm worried that it's going to be additive and subtract from our ability to properly support FinCEN and BSA rules.
So my guess is that you're contacting FinCEN saying, we need a delay, we need clarity, we need some input here.
I think the primary thing would be we need clarity and simplicity for our customers and for our banks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, who's also the ranking member of Financial Institutions Subcommittee. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses. I'll try again at something that I think could make all this stuff work a lot better and get better quality data into the database, and that's mobile ID or digital driver's licenses. Are you all familiar with this? This is the ability to present a real ID compliant driver's license, a document that already exists that's issued by all the states, and present that in a pretty fraud-resistant way using your cell phone, and to take advantage of the fact that a modern cell phone can be used basically as a biometric security dongle. So, Mr. Selenke, when someone wants to come in and to open a bank account, you've got to do your KYC on them. The customer gets out the cell phone, does the biometric login, shows them, then verifies that that is the cell phone that was associated with the digital driver's license, which is a document that's pretty hard to fake. It's hard. A real ID compliant driver's license is something where it's hard to get multiple licenses in multiple states, which is the root of a lot of identity fraud. And so if you can simply present that document that already exists in state databases with the biometrics, and if you can present that online or in person, then that simplifies the heck out of this process. In countries that have this, where you want to register a company, one of those steps is to get out your cell phone and prove that you are who you say you are online. This is also something that's going to be absolutely crucial when you look at the artificial intelligence deepfakes that we're going to have. There's going to be a wave of identity fraud coming at us. So this will be an essential tool for that. In the last session of Congress, we got within one member of Congress in finally getting the government at least to accept this. But then because our system allows one member of Congress to throw a crowbar in the works, we were unable to get it in the omnibus at the end. But it's close. And the people of the United States, I think, are ready for this. The ACLU issued a report that you'd expect, as you expected, was all full of real worries about privacy, but in the end it concluded, if you read the last paragraph of their report on mobile ID, that if this is done right, it will be good for privacy and good for equity in our country. We made a major step forward in breaking the digital divide, and as part of the infrastructure bill, now even someone with no assets has the right to a subsidized internet contract, which is the barrier for this. And I would venture to say that of the 35 million companies that you talk about, every one of them has a cell phone, to a very good approximation. So that this is something, the technology for this was developed by NIST in the Obama administration, and it is deployed on every one of your cell phones today. We have the ability to do this, and if we actually simply allowed the federal government to set standards for interoperability and for digital presentation of this and issuing of these things, it would be a game changer. Simply, if we had allowed it for government operations, if it had been in place at the start of COVID, we would have avoided more than $60 billion of identity fraud and taxpayer losses. So this is huge. It is something that, frankly, almost the entire civilized world is ahead of us on. That if you're in, name your country, starting with Estonia and Korea, who I think lead the world, but just almost all, the European Union, every country is doing this. And so when you want to open a company, you simply say, okay, I want to open my company. You get out your cell phone, prove that everyone involved is who they say they are, because that's a huge issue in getting high quality data into this. So I was wondering if any of you have reactions about that, how much simpler that could make things if there was a realistic expectation that U.S. citizens who wanted could have access to a secure digital ID. Anyone want to comment on that?
That would be a leap forward, because I think the biggest sticking point we're going to see practically are beneficial owners that are reluctant to provide copies, PDFs of their driver's license, or on the rare occasion a passport. So if that replaces id.me.gov or whatever it might be, that would be a step forward, because again, that is probably the biggest sand in the gears aspect of the overreach in the rulemaking.
Yeah. Mr. Selenke?
Yes, Congressman, from a banking perspective, as they say, the devil is in the details. But from a banking perspective, if there is an ID that is acceptable and understandable and difficult to manipulate, it's something we would be interested in taking advantage of.
Yeah, no, it's the mobile ID. It's being deployed by lots of states, and when we should just adopt it federally, and life would get easier for law enforcement and for businesses and for the average American. Thank you, and my time's up, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Iowa. Mr. Nunn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member for holding this, and thank you very much for the panel being here to discuss with this. I want to begin, first of all, by thanking FinCEN for the wide range that it does. At the same time, I'm going to speak to my small businesses today. I'm going to share with the committee this test delete page that was screen captured. It's the exact page where our small businesses are supposed to be trusting their federal government is going to be protecting, preserving, and providing for the protection of the information that they're offering to FinCEN. But this was left live for 5 days, leading us to believe that the tech problems at the institution have been addressed when clearly they have not. I'd like to submit the screenshot and the IRS news release for the record.
Without objection.
The beneficial ownership database was crafted not to be public-facing. Unlike UK companies, for a reason, this information is highly sensitive. A misstep could be disastrous for millions of Americans, and slip-ups like the one I just showcased in here that could hemorrhage this information and a lack of final access rule make me extremely worried about FinCEN's ability to secure data properly. And I think millions of Americans feel the same way. Secondly, the IRS released a newsletter that warned taxpayers to be on the lookout for new scams and mailings that tries to mislead people into believing that they are owed a refund. Much of the same data that this scam asked for is what FinCEN will be requiring through their BOI rulemaking. FinCEN's lack of clarity around this proposal deeply worries me that they will not be able to ensure similar gimmicks do not stand the test of time. Hence, one of the reasons why we are introducing a bill called the Protecting Small Businesses and Preventing Illicit Financial Activity Act, which here today does two things I'd like to share with the panel. First, it would force FinCEN to remove its escape hatch that allows companies to check if they are unable to identify or unable to attain determinations. This opt-out that FinCEN is creating would allow the very same foreign entities and terrorist organizations that we are trying to eliminate to go unchecked. The very reason a bipartisan Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act in the first place. Second, it would force FinCEN to revert its beneficial ownership filing deadline to the agreed-upon deadline by the four corners of Congress. For existing small businesses, this would be a statutorily mandated 2 years from the 1-year extension FinCEN established, and for newly registered small businesses, this would be 90 days, which was shortened by FinCEN to only 30 days. I agree with Ms. Beatty here that there are a number of loopholes that need to be addressed. This is something that a bipartisan group on this committee believe is important. Look, my bill came as I reached out to my Iowa State Small Business Development Center, and the state director talked to me about the beneficial ownership rules, to which she responded that she had not heard anything from several businesses or FinCEN regarding the implementation of rulemaking. Her response, and I quote, "SBDC, being an outreach arm of the Small Business Administration, thus a partner with the government to assist businesses, one would think that we would have a great resource to assist them with such outreach efforts. If you have concerns with them, please encourage them to reach out to our national-wide assets so that we can begin helping our business clients." So that takes us to the task at hand. Mr. Richards, can you discuss the escape hatch that FinCEN would include for entities that may be unable to identify their tax identification number or TIN?
I cannot explain the escape hatch. It was a absolute surprise to everybody. I think Elise Bean, who used to be the, general counsel on the permanent subcommittee on investigations, called it the worst form she had seen in 40 years of government service. But FinCEN has heard the feedback and has said, yes, we've pulled that form back. We're gonna look at it again. I would expect that if, clear heads prevail, there will be no ability for a reporting company to choose, I don't know, as an option on the form.
Or even a reporting company, a foreign entity having a shell company that doesn't want to disclose. Luckily, at this point, we're able to, unfortunately, we've seen what's happened in the past here, and people have taken advantage of it. Mr. Kuhlman, what percentage of small businesses would be able to comply with this in your estimation?
At this point in time, I don't know about any because they don't know what the form is, or they don't, there's still some unclear definitions and there is no guidance, but hopefully by the end of the 6 months, it's at least some.
And hopefully with some clarifying legislation, we'll be able to do that. How many companies in America right now would be able to provide their TIN to the FinCEN team? Would you say it's the overwhelming majority have a tax identification number?
Yeah, but I would also caution that the taxpayer identification number was not required as part of the law. I would recommend just sticking to the 4 required fields.
Understood. With that, very quickly, Mr. Selenke, what does CTA implementation look like for rural banks in places like Iowa and Missouri?
It will be very difficult. It's another additive requirement, and with the resources, it would be very difficult.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time. My time has expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Geitheimer, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Ranking Member. Mr. Kalman, while I'm happy to see FinCEN make progress on rules to implement the Corporate Transparency Act, I'm concerned by the barriers law enforcement could face, including a requirement to obtain a court order before accessing the beneficial ownership directory and reporting requirements after the fact. Can you describe how these additional barriers will affect law enforcement's investigations, please?
Thank you for the question. During the negotiations for the rule, we went through, in this committee and others around Congress that were involved, went through very, very specific negotiations, creating a series of protocols to ensure that there's security of the data. Obviously, nothing's perfect, but people felt at the end of the day that we had gotten to a place where there was some level of security. The problem with the additional hurdles for state and local law enforcement, which don't exist, by the way, for federal law enforcement, is quite significant. The information we're talking about is often at the beginning of an investigation for law enforcement, and if they can't have access to this initial data, it is very difficult to move forward with an investigation, and these investigations can be complicated and costly, and they could just get dropped.
Thank you. Continuing, if I can, in March 2022, I joined Committee Chairs Waters and Sherrod Brown in calling for GAO to conduct a review of the tools used by domestic violent extremists to finance their activities here in the United States. I'm looking forward to seeing the results of GAO's review in the coming months, which I hope will shed light on the ways these groups fund themselves. Mr. Kalman, can you describe the ways in which domestic violent extremists like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys could conceal their fundraising activities through the use of shell companies or other anonymous organizations? Would a strong beneficial ownership directory help law enforcement monitor the activities of these groups?
We've seen shell companies, or anonymous companies, I should say, being used by any number of bad actors, whether it's terrorist organizations, human trafficking operations, drug cartels, other organizations. I believe there was the STAR Initiative said that it was the Global Witness that coined the phrase that the anonymous companies are the getaway car for criminals and the corrupt. So yes, I think that the idea behind the Corporate Transparency Act is in fact to require companies, shell companies or those that would hide behind corporate structures to come clean or not be able to register.
So you've seen evidence of anonymous companies flooding markets with counterfeit products at the expense of U.S. small businesses?
Yes, and in my testimony, my written testimony, we submitted a report by David Luna, who's a former national security official. He did a look at the impact on businesses and the use of anonymous companies, both for counterfeited and pirated goods, but also companies that were scam artists for larger companies, so subcontractors of companies ripping off larger companies. It was used to defraud a number of the business sector.
Thank you. Small business advocates, including NFIB, in their letter of comment, have raised concerns that some of FinCEN's BOI rules were not explicitly outlined in statute and create costly and complicated requirements for our nation's smallest businesses. Mr. Kuhlman, what revisions could be made to reduce the compliance burden for small businesses while still allowing law enforcement to identify bad actors? Please.
I think fewer beneficial owners, less people having to be listed under substantial control. They expanded that definition. A little bit broader timelines for initial reports and updates. That'd be where I'd start, but I'd be happy to follow up with other ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. And despite Congress's intent to keep the requirements for reporting companies limited to the most useful and important information, many small businesses still have questions about when and how to file. Just asking a further question, do you believe FinCEN should do more to help small businesses understand the rules and requirements of the CTA? And if so, what should a FinCEN engagement plan look like?
Yes, Congressman Gottheimer, I think just getting some guidance out quickly as kind of required by the Small Business Regulatory Fair Flexibility Act would be great. And then once that guidance is issued, making sure it is distributed broadly, whether it's through SBDCs, as Mr. Nunn suggested, or other, just basically using every tool in government. Anyone who does interact with small businesses would be a good start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Tennessee. Mr. Ogles is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our panelists. We're getting close to the end, guys, but we thank you for being here, and we certainly appreciate you. Like all, I think, we're concerned about the small businesses and the compliance costs and, inadvertently kind of getting trapped in this rulemaking process. Mr. Selenke, kind of echoing Mr. Kuhlman's comments, You know, I understand this might require some guessing, but what percentage of the clients of your bank or similar institutions who were newly designated as reporting companies do you think actually know about the designation? And we won't hold you to this number, by the way, so, you know, we're having fun here.
Yeah, I mean, Congressman, the number would be 0 or close to 0.
Right, yes, sir. How many would you guess are familiar with FinCEN at all?
For our customers, the only ones who would be aware of it are those who have interacted with it already. So money service businesses and individuals that have to deal with large currency reporting.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mr. Kuhlman, do the businesses you represent typically wake up in the morning with bated breath and excitement to follow the news of FinCEN?
No, sir. But we are asking our members in a recent banking survey, so we'll be able to follow up of if they are familiar with this. It's just not ready yet, but it should be soon, so we'll get you that.
Yes, sir. And again, I think that's the hedge, right, is that we have an agency that is, you know, imposing on small businesses, many of whom are struggling to turn on the lights. They're busy running their businesses, and suddenly now you have this rulemaking authority that is essentially legislating authority, and it's time that we have clear communications with our businesses by letting Congress do its job, not some sort of alphabet agency. But we've already discussed the burdens that this rule places on small businesses, on community banks, so we should consider whether it's worth it. Mr. Selenke, you have a wealth of experience in keeping crime out of financial systems. Do you believe this rule is the silver bullet that will finally stop the flow of cash to the drug cartels?
Congressman, no. I mean, there will be movement of funds through financial institutions, and it's very difficult to identify. I think this can help identify players, but it won't stop the flow of funds.
And do you think it's been refined to the point that it will help banks avoid exposure to criminal enterprises?
Currently, no. As it is written, it is focused only on the customer due diligence portion of the discussion. As a bank, to understand our customers and what's happening, we have the whole know your customer process, from onboarding to their ongoing activity to sanction screening. And the way it is currently written, it only focuses on a very narrow point of that review, so it would not have much value to us at this point.
Well, so we have a rule that many of the reporting companies don't know exists and therefore can't carry out, that could therefore cause well-intentioned businesses, owners, legal trouble, that's designed in a way that makes compliance unnecessarily difficult. In their own form, was criticized for being, let's face it, absurd. I think it would be obvious at this point that FinCEN should pull back. That it's time to go back to the drawing board and perhaps talk to someone like you, Mr. Kuhlman, who represents businesses, businesses, I think, by and large, I would say 99.9% want to comply, want to have no contact with illicit businesses. And so you're the perfect conduit. You all are perfect conduits for, like, how do we do this and do it in a responsible manner? Really quickly, China has engaged in unfair trade practices such as currency manipulation, along with the campaign of intellectual property theft and economic espionage, targeting U.S. companies in addition to human rights violations and facilitating the fentanyl crisis across our southern border into every small town in America. Considering the real threat that China poses to the United States of America on, quite frankly, many fronts, I would kind of posit that the real focus here should be China, the illicit actors that are using our southern border and the cartels to move money in and out, and quite frankly, cargo in and out of this country, versus targeting hardworking Americans who are trying to run businesses, who are trying to do the right thing. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. I'm out of time, so I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. That would go to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kim, who's also the vice chairman of this subcommittee. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Beatty for holding this hearing. The FinCEN finalized the first rule under the Corporate Transparency Act, the beneficial ownership information reporting requirements, which we've been talking about all day. That was released on September 30, 2022, about 10 months ago. But the rules will be effective on January 1, in less than 6 months. Mr. Kuhlman, you represent an organization that advocates for the interests of small businesses. So I wanted to get your assessment of how well informed your small businesses that you represent are about the BOI, and do you believe that beneficial ownership rules should be delayed, giving small businesses more time to learn about the law and get ready to comply?
I don't think there's much familiarity right now, and there's not clear guidance, and there's still some ambiguity on who must report. So I would definitely support a delay. Congress allows for a delay, or for a 2-year implementation, excuse me. That's consistent with how long the implementation of that customer due diligence rule is. So I think it makes a whole lot of sense. At a minimum, as Chairman McHenry has a bill that says you should not have it should not become effective until all these rules are finalized, and you should be able to comment concurrently on all 3 rules, I believe.
Thank you. You know, Congress intended for CTA to be very simple for most small business owners, and it was supposed to be a postcard-like form that would take a seamless amount of time to complete, but it seems that FinCEN has turned that into something else. So I want to ask you, how much time do you anticipate it's taking to take for small businesses to fill that out? And can you tell us, us and those who are watching, how long is the form? How many questions are included in BOI?
The draft form had 50 questions. When you just copied and pasted from regulations.gov, it's 8 pages. Now, I'm sure the government form will be smaller print, wider margins, so it'll look different. But still, it's a pretty intimidating form with a lot of drop downs and sub questions based on it.
So do you anticipate that small businesses will need to hire in external vendors or outside third parties to submit the form appropriately? Because, we're hearing very low numbers from UK database, but we're expecting the cost to be much higher than the UK numbers. So can you dig into that a little more?
Yes, an analogy is that for tax compliance, you have your CPA. 90% of NFIB members utilize a CPA. I do anticipate that we'll at least go to them to at least ask, is this legitimate and can you help me do it? And I think it's going to depend on state to state whether the State Bar Association might view those experts as unauthorized practice of law. I know for some of the larger firms, they've already said, we're not going to help with this compliance. It's my understanding that might be because the liability is too much for them. But I'm afraid that trickles down to some of the smaller ones, and there might not be an avenue to go, or you might have to go find an attorney who may be even higher cost. So I believe there will be a substantial cost to comply.
We got to make it easier for small businesses to comply, and this is making it very difficult, for sure. The FinCEN has yet to finalize rule number 2. That will lay out how highly sensitive beneficial ownership is maintained, protected, and accessed by law enforcement and financial institutions. So given this lack of clarity, how will the ineffective access rule impact your ability to carry out your ongoing CDD obligations?
I would be interested in...
Mr. Selenke, can you answer that?
Thank you, Congresswoman Kim. Without clear access, we need to understand that. So at this point, we have no idea how we would access it, what that access would look like, and who would be authorized to access it. And for a larger company, that's going to be difficult because we'll have a large number of needs to occasionally reference that information.
So every time a new comes out, we expect the businesses to comply. I'm asking this follow-up questions in general. Probably, Mr. Kuhlman, you can answer this. Do you believe that FinCEN has done its due diligence, educating, informing, and doing through their active outreach program to inform the small businesses about this new BOI coming down? You probably had this conversation before, but I wanted to ask.
At this point, I do not believe it's been sufficient. I'll just say that.
Well, with that, I yield my time. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time's expired. All questioners have expanded or are out of time. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being with us today. You guys did a great job. Thank you so much. I just have one thought. I've got several thoughts jotted down here, but I'll just expound on one. But throughout the hearing here, it's been mentioned many times that that FinCEN is going beyond the intent of the law in their rulemaking and their proposals. The Supreme Court has just, within the last 13 months, struck down 3 different major decisions by the administration and its agencies. They went beyond the law and what they were doing, what they were opposing. A number of you represent associations. I hope that you're looking at the possibility of taking these FinCEN to court. When they go beyond the letter of the law, they have to be reined in. And this, to me, when you're talking about a $32 billion original cost, Mr. Kuhlman's figures are, and $5.6 billion per year to comply, that's a huge issue, a huge burden on our small businesses that had better be done right. And it better be done according to the way Congress intended. If not, I think you have a legitimate reason to go after them. And I think that I'm hopeful that FinCEN will hear what we're talking about here today and stop the nonsense, get back in its pew, in its lane with its rulemaking, and hopefully we can get this done in a better way. Ms. Beatty, would you like to ask a few questions?
Thank you.
Or make a comment?
Thank you so much for that. Again, let me just thank the witnesses for being here and certainly shedding light on this. Also, thank you for the financial information that was helpful from another country, the UK, to see that small amount. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Congressman Nunn, who referenced the bipartisanship and taking a look at what we can do, and hopefully we can take some of the information from here, because I think the objective is as we move into this new era of finance that we're going to be into, it's going to be very much like it was decades ago when we worked on CTA. So it's here, and I think we have an obligation on both ends to figure out why or how it doesn't go beyond the intent of Congress, but also how we figure out what's best for small businesses, bankers, and FinCEN. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With that, without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for their response. Ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. With that, this hearing is adjourned.